This week begins sentencing hearings for Freedom Convoy frontrunners Chris Barber and Tamara Leach. But is the prosecution politically motivated? Well, we are going to chat about that with political columnist Brian Lilley of the Toronto Sun. But first, Prime Minister Mark Carney is meeting with premiers from across the country to update them on trade talks with the United States. So will there be more tariffs or will there not be? Joining me now is Brian Lilley. Brian, welcome back. Great to have you with us.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, so let's get right into the Trump trade talk. So last week, Prime Minister Carney said that it would be rather unlikely that there would be a deal without tariffs, but the Americans are now saying a deal without tariffs is possible. So what's changed?
You know, as is often the case, it's the message coming out of Washington. And, this is an area where I've been very critical of the Carney government. I don't think they've handled the negotiations and the trade talks with Trump particularly well. I think he has the wrong person in charge in Ambassador Kristen Hillman. I think it should be Intergovernmental Affairs Minister, or I think it's still that Dominic LeBlanc. That's the guy that I think should be in charge. Their cabinet positions may have shifted a bit, but because you need a political closer in there. So I've been critical of him on that, but on the other hand, dealing with Donald Trump is a bit difficult. I was speaking with one Liberal MP who said, look, you got to remember, it's like you're wrestling a huge gorilla naked and in the dark. You don't know what's coming next. And Trump is kind of like that. He'd been signaling that there would be no agreement without some form of tariffs. And so I thought when Prime Minister Carney came out last week ahead of the cabinet meeting and said that to reporters, that it's unlikely, that he was softening the ground, that he was trying to prepare Canadians to accept the inevitable, which is a message I've been hearing since I was in Washington last February. But then this past weekend, Trump's Commerce Secretary, Howard Lutnick, ended up giving an interview to CBS's Face the Nation. And Margaret Brennan, the host, was pressing him several times on what this means for Canada. Will there be a deal with Canada with or without tariffs? And he talked about how, well, most stuff already enters the U.S. tariff-free due to the nature of the Canada-U.S.-Mexico agreement. But, you should expect smaller countries to pay a tariff, but the larger economies won't if, and this is the big if they open up their economies. And the fact is, we don't know what that means, Jeanette.
No, we do not. That's for sure. And like you mentioned, Trump, so unpredictable. And you mentioned, Brian, the Trump administration says that a deal is possible if we open up enough. So what does this mean? Do we know how open is open, or what do we need to be offering them? Do we need to?
Well, I think the Carney administration knows. I think the PMO knows. But do the rest of us? Look, there's a lot of Canadian protectionist policies that have been in place for decades, going back to the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, that, maybe they fit the time, but they don't necessarily, they're not needed now. Protections for our big banks, our media companies, our telecommunications companies. Do they need to stay in place? Do the Americans want to see American Airlines or Delta or United flying Canada's friendly skies between, say, Red Deer and Saskatoon, or do they want the big American banks like J.P. Morgan Chase do they want their names on the bank towers down at Bay Street here in Toronto? We don't know, and we don't know if they want supply management. Do they want supply management opened up? Do they want it done away with? They've clearly said a deal is possible if we open up enough, but we don't know what that means. And so if I was one of the premiers in the meetings with Prime Minister Carney earlier today, I would have asked him two questions. Is a deal possible without tariffs? And what's the price? Because it might be a price we're willing to pay. I had a long discussion with Martha Hall Finley, who's at the University of Calgary's School of Public Policy, former Liberal MP. And she laid out the case, in her view, for why supply management should be done away with from a Canadian point of view, and how it would, help the Canadian economy. But there's a lot of Canadians, and not just dairy farmers, attached to supply management or attached to some of the protectionist policies. But are you willing to say to every other industry in the country, you're going to accept tariffs as part of our new trade deal because we want to keep mostly Quebec dairy farmers happy? that would be a tough sell for Mark Carney. So we need to know a bit more about what's going on in these negotiations. What's up for grabs?
Yeah, no, exactly. Speaking of trade agreements, so Saskatchewan joined the agreement that Alberta and Ontario signed a few weeks ago on building new trade and energy infrastructure. And premiers have talked a lot about cooperation and dropping internal trade barriers, but have they actually made any progress on that front?
There has been some progress, and I would say that Alberta and Saskatchewan and Ontario have all been quite good at that. There's memorandums of understanding between all of them on dropping that. Nova Scotia's been quite good. Quebec less so. BC, Manitoba, they're kind of preoccupied with wildfires at the moment, so I'll cut Premier Wabkinew some slack. But there's been some progress, but the idea that all of them are being eliminated, I don't think is realistic. Every province wants to hold on to something. These are all policies that were put in place for the most part to protect a local industry, to give a local business a leg up over a competitor from another province. They just shouldn't exist, but that's why they're there. And so there's always political pressure to look after your own. And so the idea of getting rid of all of them, highly unlikely. The federal government has gotten rid of their portion of interprovincial trade barriers, but I expect some provinces to hold on to a portion of theirs, and some provinces a bigger portion than others.
All right. Let's switch gears here completely. Coming up tomorrow, July 23rd, is the start of 2 days of sentencing hearings for Tamara Leach and Chris Barber, two of the organizers of the Freedom Convoy. And they were convicted of mischief back in April, and now the Crown wants sentences that you, Brian, say show this to be politically motivated, a politically motivated prosecution. You're not the only one saying this, by the way. So tell us more.
Well, nobody gets 7 or 8 year sentences for mischief in Canada. And that's what Tamara Litch and Chris Barber were convicted of, mischief. That can result in a very short custodial sentence, or in most cases, no custodial sentence at all, meaning no jail time. Um, the Crown is asking for 7 years for Tamara Litch and 8 years for Chris Barber. I mean, they weren't convicted of the other charges of intimidation or counseling to intimidate. They were convicted of mischief. We have people convicted of heinous crimes in this country getting very light sentences, often with the approval of the Crown, not just because a judge said so, but with the approval of Crown prosecutors. So this tells me that this is even more politically motivated on the part of Crown Attorney Dallas Mack. That's the name of the lead Crown Attorney in Ottawa. There is no way that they would be going forward with such ridiculous sentence recommendations without the approval of Crown Attorney Dallas Mack. He's not the lead, but he would have to approve this going forward. The justice in this case is a woman named Heather Perkins McVeigh. So let's hope that she has more common sense, more wisdom than Crown Attorney Mack, because 7 and 8 years is a ridiculous sentence. You can loathe the Freedom Convoy as much as you want, and there are plenty of people in Ottawa, especially downtown Ottawa, who do. But you need to have a justice system that operates on principles of fairness and justice, not retribution. And that's what this feels like. Part of the sentencing recommendations cites that, well, there was a lot of money lost. Well, there's still a civil proceeding going forward as well. So, are you going to sentence them to 7 and 8 years because of money lost by various businesses to the local city of Ottawa economy, and then try and pry that money from them in a civil case as well? None of that seems fair.
Yeah.
And look, I'm one of those people who said, yeah, the people in the Freedom Convoy have a point. On a lot of their issues, they have a point. Some of it was misguided, especially there was that one faction that wanted to say, we want to meet with the Governor General and replace the government. That was crazy, but that wasn't Tamara Litch and Chris Barber, by the way. But I was also the guy who said, you've got to be a law and order person, and these guys should have been told at the end of the first day, go home, come back tomorrow. You can't live on a street indefinitely. I opposed what they were doing, but I also opposed the Emergencies Act, and now I oppose the 7 and 8 year sentence. You've got to have common sense and fairness, and it seems like with the Freedom Convoy, all kinds of people, but especially on the so-called progressive left, have thrown that out the window, and they want anger and retribution They wouldn't, if you and I were calling for this for a heinous murderer, they would be saying, well, this is not how we do justice. But on the Freedom Convoy, they're willing to suspend that. Let's hope that the judge doesn't do that. So there'll be hearings on Wednesday and Thursday. Then Justice Perkins McVeigh will take a couple of weeks to draw up her sentence. I'm hoping for a slap on the wrist, like no custodial sentence. Tamara Lich has already spent 49 days in jail, a 45-day trial. This has cost the taxpayers millions upon millions of dollars. We don't need more costs added to it. Let's move on.
Keeping on the topic of courts here, Brian, last week the Supreme Court issued a ruling overturning an adult sentence for a man just shy of his 18th birthday in a heinous murder. And you say this ruling will make it nearly impossible to hand out adult sentences in the future. So tell us more about this one, Brian.
This is a guy only identified by his initials as IM, and he approached a group of guys he knew who were all over the age of 18 and said, look, I want to get a gun, and I believe this guy has a gun. Now, IM was 17 years, 5 months old at the time of this offense, which he has been convicted of. And the others involved in the attack were convicted and given adult sentences because they were over the age of 18.
Yeah.
They approached this other kid from the neighborhood who was shoveling snow next to his family home and said they wanted the gun, and then proceeded to beat him. 12 stab wounds and 10 blunt force injuries later, he was left to die in the snow. They then went into the home, pistol whipped this 17-year-old's mother, and ransacked the house looking for the gun, which they didn't find before the father and brother came home, at which point they fled. IM brags about his role in this attack, which he knows led to somebody's death. He brags about it to another friend, shows off his bloody clothes, leaves the country, and isn't arrested until he comes back 2 years later. He's convicted and given an adult sentence. Now, the Supreme Court looks at the legislation, looks at the judge's ruling, and says, no, this is wrong. The legislation just says the judge has to be satisfied that the Crown Attorney has made the case that the underage youth has the moral culpability to have an adult sentence, that they knew what they were doing. The Supreme Court now says, no, you must prove that beyond a reasonable doubt, the same as a murder conviction. Except how do you know someone's inner workings to that degree? Parliament had considered changing the legislation more than once. They considered changing the legislation to include the very part that the Supreme Court has now read in. That the Crown has to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that they had the moral culpability. And they rejected that at least twice. And the Supreme Court has now said, no, this is the way it has to be. They have rewritten the law against the will of Parliament on sentencing to fit with their own political views. Justice Suzanne Cote, who wrote the dissent, it was a 7-2 decision, she blasts her colleagues in that. And this ruling will effectively make it impossible or near impossible in most cases to say that a 17-year-old who commits a heinous crime should get an adult sentence.
Yeah, Brian, that is a horrible, horrible story. But it looks like we are unfortunately out of time here. There were so many more questions I needed to ask you, but thanks so much for being with us today, Brian.
Thank you.
Federal political columnist Brian Lilley of the Toronto Sun.